Alex, welcome to the podcast. Thanks
Thanks,
so
Matthew.
much.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate you reaching out. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, man. Well, I wanted to ask you, how religious was your childhood and upbringing and your family?
I have to be pretty honest. Religion was pretty much absent from my household when I was growing up. Um, Without getting into much detail, both of my parents were raised in different ways in pretty religious households.
Hmm.
And so after going to a religious high school together, and sort of separating themselves from it,
Hmm.
they became very secular, let's say,
Yeah.
after leaving home. The closest that I came to religion in my younger years was like sometimes praying with my dad in the evening. And it was very strange because everyone around me at school, growing up in the South, in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, everyone was a Protestant Christian. And it was very strange for me because they were all, praying to Jesus and talking about what denomination they were. And I didn't fit into that at all. But the closest that I came to it was sometimes in the evening or before eating, my dad and I would pray, and we would always pray to the Heavenly Father. So it was kind of a term that, at the time was already setting myself apart. It was already very different than what I was hearing around me at school, but and it never really even was situated within a particular religion, let's say, except for, of course, we're praying to this patriarchal being. However, yeah, that's the closest that it kind of came until later on, and then I started at times going to church with friends, which was very eye-opening, to say
Hmm.
the least.
Your dad kind of preserved a little bit of his own spirituality, I guess, to pray at least.
Absolutely. And I think both of my parents kind of found ways to incorporate spirituality into their, into their daily lives.
Hmm.
But they had to figure out a different way to do it. And so, neither one of them, at least in my experience, I hate to speak on their behalf, but I've yet to see them kind of settle into a firm, spiritual or religious practice, let's say.
Yeah. And when you said that when you went to church with your friends, it was really eye-opening, do you mean that it was eye-opening in the sense that it showed you these really specific things about their religious ideology that you didn't necessarily know, or how was it eye-opening?
It was jarring and shocking, are two words that I'll use. It was also alienating in some ways in my earlier years, and confusing. It,
Yeah.
so there was nothing really positive about it. I remember in elementary school going to some like Sunday school services with a few of my friends. And it was really strange because my only friends that went to church regularly were the bad kids. Um, and so we would go to Sunday school and they would misbehave in Sunday school just like they would in school.
Yeah.
And I was kind of like the good kid that was friends with these bad kids. And it was just confusing to me because we would go to church and be in these buildings surrounded by these other kids and these parents, and it just didn't quite make sense to me, because it just seemed like sort of I don't know, like a school-like environment that didn't really seem to have an effect on my friends or on their parents, because the behaviors they were exhibiting, and the beliefs too, even at that stage. I mean, it all just kind of seemed like a show or like an activity
Yeah.
that they went to, but didn't really affect them.
Yeah.
So sort of like this poor performance in school, of them, I also saw like in church, and it was confusing. And then a little bit later on in middle school, I would go from time to time to a friend's church, and I would just see a lot of what I would call groupthink, or what I would call like performative emotional outburst. I'm not sure how else
Mhm.
to really classify it, but there was a lot of crying, and there was a lot of sort of guilting and shaming, and coming from the leaders, coming from adults, and then you have the emotional response and the feelings of guilt and shame from the kids. So that was kind of, I remember that was in sixth grade, when I
Mm.
first had this experience of being in a church in a youth service and thinking, this is strange. And one time in particular, I went to church with a girl that I was, dating as a sixth grader, and
Yeah.
they, I mean, it was a Wednesday night service, and there was an adult in front of the room, guilting and shaming and everything. And by the end of that service, all of the kids in the room, all, around the same age, were in the front of the room, kneeling, with their hands down on the ground, weeping. I mean, weeping and moaning. And I was in the back of the room, the only one in my chair, just kind of like, sitting there.
Yeah.
Um,
It's wild how I've been in a situation like that several times when I was younger. It wasn't quite, from my memory, I don't, the experiences I had weren't as focused on the guilt and the shame, but I'm sure that was there, and maybe I've blocked some of that out of my memory. But I do know exactly what you mean in terms of this weird kind of emotional wave that goes through the room where the kids get sucked into it, and it triggers a lot of emotions. And I also know what you mean about how the performative element of it, and um the kind of the feeling that at church usually the kids aren't genuinely connected with it in any certain way. It feels just like school, and they're misbehaving and doing the same things they would at school. And I was that way. I mean, I went to church every Sunday with my family, but I was just talking to my friends. I didn't have any personal resonance with the religious content or anything like that. So that's very interesting. So on a personal level, outside of a church atmosphere and outside of any strict religious doctrine or context, do you feel like you had any sense of your own spirituality when you were growing up? Like, did you pray or think about what God might mean when you were young and stuff?
Not really, to be honest. Um, I mean, when I prayed with my father, it was just something that we did, at the end of the day. And in the same way that my dad would sort of tell me stories, it was kind of like the bookend to the day. And sometimes when we sat down to eat, I mean, again, it was kind of like it was the ritual without the meaning behind it, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Because I mean, eating was such a big deal for me and my dad. Food is a huge sort of staple in our relationship, and so kind of praying to this larger being before eating just kind of made sense because we were always feasting and about to feast.
Yeah.
Um, but in terms of being curious. I didn't really become, I wouldn't say that I became really curious until I got to university,
Okay.
and started learning about Buddhism, really.
Nice.
And then just Eastern philosophy and spirituality in general. And that's
Okay.
when I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that's the first time that I was really interested. I was also interested in transcendentalism in high school. After reading The American Transcendentalist, And prior to that, there was a very brief period where I was dating a girl in late middle school, early high school, where her family was going to church, and I tried to understand, but again, like I couldn't.
Yeah.
It didn't click with me at all. So yeah.
Um, Even though you didn't feel like you had your own spirituality or thought about God much, did you have any mysterious experiences when you were young by any chance? Like anything, synchronistic or paranormal or mystical?
That's a good question. I remember, I'll talk about just a couple of things.
Okay.
Um, I remember when I was pretty young, it's one of my earliest memories, like around the age of 5, 4 or 5. Um, and I don't really know how to explain this, and I don't know why. I haven't even researched this, because I'm sure that the answer is out there. But when I was, again, like 4 or 5, I remember being like in my mom's apartment. My parents are divorced, and they were divorced when I was 3. And so I remember being in my mom's apartment, and the lights being off in my room and the lights being on in the hallway. And I remember like going through the hallway and then coming into my room. And as I was going in, I noticed that sort of the room itself seemed like pixelated to me. I don't really know. I still don't know how to explain it. But you've probably noticed if you've, like, I don't know, held your eyes closed for
Yeah.
30 seconds or something and then opened them, you can kind of see what I thought at the time were, no, it was like sort of white noise on a television, kind of, or what I'm sure could be explained now is just being our own sort of brain processing what our eyes are seeing. But that was kind of a moment where I thought, what is this, and what is behind it? Because to me, it seemed like there was something that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I was very curious about it. And I remember going and getting my mom and saying, "Mom, come here. Like, what is that?" And she said, "What is what? I don't see anything." And I was like, "No, but," and I described it as being, sort of these, I don't know, dots, sort of,
Yeah.
um, etc. And so I know that that's not something that's necessarily that strange, but I have to say it is definitely a very early moment where I have a very clear memory of experiencing something that people around me couldn't explain, but to
Yeah.
me was well, worth thinking about, let's say.
Okay. So when you were in high school, you got into the Transcendentalists. Was that through school or through kind of outside of class you got into it somehow?
Um, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I mean, I really hated high school in so many ways. I was so bored with what we were reading. I was so over it. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm not really quite sure how I discovered the Transcendentalist.
Which one?
That's that that
Which one resonated with you the most? Was Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman?
um First of all, let me backtrack. That's a total lie. It's because of the Dead Poet Society. Like, of
Ah,
course,
there we go.
right? Which is also one of the earliest reasons why I wanted to become a teacher in the first place, right?
Nice.
Um, um, so yeah, it was Whitman first, and then I made my way back through Thoreau and Emerson.
I've been well, so my first couple years of college, I gradually went through a pretty deep Christian phase. And then in the summer of 2007, I took an American Romanticism class after well, I guess a couple semesters after I had become an English major. But the Transcendentalists were a really great transition for me, because it was transitioning from a Christian centric spirituality to something that was broader and more expansive and more inclusive and more open. And that summer there was a bunch of stuff happening for me, but that was definitely a big part of it. And at that, I guess it was Emerson actually that really hit me the hardest, but it's Whitman that's lasted with me the longest. And I have returned to Emerson actually several times throughout the years, and sometimes I return to him and I'm like, it doesn't hit me as hard as it used to. But in the past several months, I've rediscovered the genius of Emerson for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the sort of an early memory that I have is just reading the beginning of Nature, and there's that, just that call to develop a direct experience with the world around you, and that being the beginning of having a meaningful sort of spiritual experience. And to me, that was so mind opening, and it seemed a lot more just real, than sort of the what we find in religion in the West.
That's what I got hooked on the most with all of them, was the unmediated experience, the direct experience that was not filtered through inherited ideology and all that stuff. And that's what eventually led me to Buddhism, I think. So I wanted to ask you about that. What are your first memories kind of realizing, oh, Buddhism might have something to offer?
This I haven't thought of before. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but I can definitely I have the beats to think.
Yes,
Absolutely,
me too.
for really helping me understand and know how to navigate um, that world. But I remember getting into DT Suzuki. I remember also getting into Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, these were two sort of thinkers and writers that I got into pretty quickly after being introduced to it. And again, it was for the same reasons that I got into transcendentalism when I was in high school. Moving on into university and just trying to again sort of I think I was actively seeking out spiritual practices, but I've always been very curious, and nothing has really worked for me, let's say, in terms of understanding what can't be understood. And so in that way, um, and also at the same time being very critical of the West and having this understanding of how flawed our society is in so many ways. Um, and so for me, it was kind of like a coming together of those two, I don't know, needs that
Right.
interested me in kind of pursuing the ideas that were present in Buddhism.
I love that. Um, I would love to hear which kind of teachings or principles in Buddhism that you connect with the most. I've been thinking about Buddhism a lot recently because I'm writing at least one chapter in the book that I'm working on about Buddhism, and I feel like the main pillars. I don't know if that's really the right word, but the main thrusts of Buddhism that I see and that really are generally there is some notion of emptiness, which can mean, it has a specific meaning, obviously, in Buddhism. Um, and kind of in Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about like the luminous clarity, which is kind of synonymous with emptiness. So that sort of thing. And interdependence is obviously a huge part, the nature of impermanence and interdependence. Yeah. So emptiness, interdependence, and impermanence. And of course, kind of the backdrop of relief of suffering because of an awareness of these things, kind of an awareness of our own self-created uh self-created suffering that comes from our delusions and all that stuff. So for you personally, what is it that has stuck with you from Buddhism that seems the most useful, I guess?
Well, I think aside from everything that you mentioned, I mean, you really mentioned each of the terms or the concepts that have definitely stuck with me. But I'll say sort of in a, because I am by no means an expert on religion, spirituality, specifically Buddhism. It's always been something that's interested me, but I've never, let's say, practiced beyond incorporating sort of, I don't know, micro practices, but maybe
Yeah.
into my, not even day to day, just sort of my being, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess the one thing that's stuck with me is understanding how flawed, let's say, the rational mind is, and how our sort of uh, conscious rational mind can can enslave us, let's say, in some ways, and how out of control our desire can get, and how important it is to incorporate meditative practice into your day to morning to afternoon to nightly sort of experience, so that you are grounded. I mean, that is what I would say. And even beyond that, what I've become even more interested in over the years is kind of the psychology that's gone into better understanding, like, let's say, these Buddhist practices, right? And how discussing, the unconscious from a Jungian perspective, for example, and then going through and seeing how, present moment awareness and mindfulness and all of this is something that, you know, um, contributes to better, let's say, heightened or improved well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And the focus on the rational mind stuff, I think I find that probably most in Zen, kind of a resistance to an overly analytical or rational mind. And I think they make a good point, because, well, whether we think about it as rationality or whether we just think about it as kind of abstraction, you know what I mean? Like, we live in a world of abstraction all the time in our heads. And, when I walk down the street, I'm usually seeing my thoughts rather than what's actually around me. So,
Exactly.
we're all just usually, and obviously, I can't speak for other people, but from what I've heard other people say and from my own direct experience, it seems like most of us are usually seeing our thoughts rather than actually the actual reality around us. So I think Buddhism really points that out, and points out how getting lost in that abstract world can cause suffering, and kind of deconditioning ourselves so that we are more present to actual reality can provide the well-being that you're talking about. So I guess we've hinted at this, but one thing I like to ask people on this is kind of like, what is your own personal spiritual philosophy? And I know the word spiritual is very ambiguous, and I want people, I kind of like that it's ambiguous, because I want people to interpret it how they already interpret it, and their own associations with it. So what would you say your spiritual philosophy is?
I wish I had a good direct answer for this
That's
question,
okay.
but I'm gonna try my best to just kind of unpack maybe
Sure.
what I think, and it's gonna be loose and drafty as
This is
well.
great. Yeah.
I think that my spiritual philosophy is grounded in the idea that we don't really know um, much of anything, and everything that we do know is filtered through our minds and through our senses. So I think that everything that we do understand is based on that, based on the purely, human experience. Um, I do believe that we have a connection to the world around us, in ways that we are not able to measure. Um, I also think at the same time that there is some larger force at hand, in the universe. And I think that it's possible that we are incapable of understanding. But I think we're always closer to having a better understanding. But at the same time, I also think that we've probably always been pretty close to understanding as well. What I mean by that is I think that what people were doing, in the caves 40,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, was probably getting very close to, at least in essence, what we're doing today. You have people that are finding ways to to alter their consciousness in order to have some sort of ecstatic experience, or some sort of introverted or experience, or an experience of arguably enlightenment.
Right.
And this is something that like we've been doing and trying to get at for like tens of thousands of years at least. So, I mean, that's kind of, I don't know, an idea of what I would say my spiritual philosophy is. Going beyond that, I think it's also very important um, to have sort of let's say, a spiritual connection to the world around us, and not just focusing on the individual. And this is something that I've had to figure out over time. I think some of it has to do with the fact that I'm from the US. Some of it has to do with sort of the fact that I'm an only child, and some of it has to do with the fact that I'm an introvert. But I, over the years, have truly understood not just um, the practical benefits to social relationships, but also the spiritual benefits as well, and how they're really one and the same. I think the individual and the larger social are quite are both equally as important. Um, I think it's important to have a balance between the two. If that makes sense.
Oof. Drop some wisdom right there. I like that. I like the emphasis on the mystery, and how the mystery leads us to be humble, and to realize that we don't know what's going on. I think that's a great place to start. I feel like that's kind of where I started my spirituality as well. Relate Connected to my own. I mean, I remember even from when I was a kid, I've just been baffled at my own existence, at the fact that anything exists. Like, so that kind of simple but psychedelic um, realization is kind of what fuels my spirituality. Connected to the mystery, and connected to the fact that I don't know what's going on. And the thing is yes, I do want to understand more, and yes, I want to like awaken in any way I can. But at the same time, I think the mystery is so much at the heart of the beauty of our lives, and the spiritual nature of our lives, that I always want to preserve uh, an acknowledgement of the mystery. And I don't think the mystery is going anywhere. We can learn about all sorts of things about ourselves and the universe, and everything on a scientific level, or on a bunch of different levels, but the mystery will still be there. We're still on a blue marble blasting through infinite space. So I really like what you said about that, and I like how you kind of brought it to the social too, because I think that that's a really important component of spirituality, is that for one, everything's interdependent, and we all are connected, whether we want to be or not. Everything's connected, and because that's the case, I think we should honor that and celebrate that, and practice acting like it. We need to act like it is connected already. We need to act like it's connected, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I do really, I relate with everything you said. That was awesome. So you mentioned that you've dabbled in Buddhism a little bit, and you find a lot of value in some of the teachings and stuff, and I guess you have tried out meditation a little bit. How do you have a meditation practice at all?
I've never developed a strict meditation practice. What usually happens is that seasonally, let's say, it changes. It might include yoga on my own, and then end with a sitting meditation. It might involve a guided imagery exercise. It might involve, let's say, walking meditation.
Hmm.
It might involve sort of the, let's say, the process of writing poetry, for one, not necessarily the active process of sitting at the keyboard, of course, but or with a notebook, but the let's say the idea generation stage, right, of getting ideas and falling into a mindset. um, I would say that those are probably the sort of the meditative practices that I follow, and it really just depends on what I need. Um, at the time, it depends on what I need. Kind of, again, I don't mean seasonally as in it's tied to the seasons, but
Right.
in some ways it is though. I mean, and some winter mornings, it's more likely that I'm going to do a sort of a meditation in bed, let's say, with headphones in and either following some sort of guided imagery exercise, or putting on ocean waves or some sort of music, and then being there intentionally, for 15 minutes, or 30 minutes, and doing that. And then during the summer, it's much more likely that I'm going to be outside, with the yoga mat.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a seasonal, patterning as well. And you're right. It's symbolically seasonal, but it's also, the actual seasons do have an impact on your mood and your behavior and what's going on at that time of the year in your life, and how your days are structured and all sorts of stuff like that. And for better or for worse, I like to keep my practice kind of varied. Like I think that can be a gift and a curse, because I kind of wish that I could be more committed to one type of practice for a long time, or even just one type of teaching. Even I dip into so many, and I'm really happy about that, because it does make me happy. And I don't see, I want to be honest enough with myself that if that sort of thing does cause me suffering, then I want to balance it out or something. But recently, my girlfriend and we've been doing a different kind of meditation every night of the week, and I love that. I like to switch it up, and it makes me excited to meditate. It makes me excited to do a different kind of practice every day. um and so you mentioned certain meditation practices that are more of what we think of as meditation, but also writing and maybe the generation of ideas when you're working on a project can be kind of a form of meditation. And I mean, I would say that even the act of writing, for me, I consider a type of meditation. Maybe, it all depends, obviously, on how we define meditation. Are there any types of other rituals or practices in your life that you feel like keep you aligned with, the life that you want to live?
Absolutely. And the most important is cooking. um, I would say I would actually add that to my meditative practices, and it's the most constant, and it's probably the most um, rewarding.
Yeah.
I cook. It is a ritual, almost every day for dinner, and I absolutely love falling into the ritual of cooking. And some of the best, I think, some of the most rewarding kind of idea generation experiences that I've had for writing have come when cooking. Um,
Cool.
and when I don't know what to do, let's say, I will put something on to cook, with a writing project. And I usually also incorporate cooking into my writing process. So if I'm like working on a project, let's say, then I might put a pot of something on and have that as, a spot or a kind of like a station.
Yeah.
I rarely sit and write for a long period of time, but I'm also not a sort of a long fiction writer. I'm a short fiction and poetry, but I prefer to have stations. So I usually have a, like standing desk, then sort of lounge area, right, and then stove. I mean, the stove is usually going. Um,
That's fascinating. I love that. I love to cook as well, and I don't cook as much as I should. And it can be such a beautiful experience, and it can be a meditative experience, and it can be very rewarding, like you're saying, because not only is it a practice, it can be a practice of mindfulness in itself. It can be it's crafting, it's like artistic, and it can bring presence into that moment, and then you get to enjoy it. I mean, then you get to enjoy the food that you cook. um and I've never, that's really funny, because for me, when I write, I don't have stations like that, but it makes me wonder if I could benefit from something like that. That's cool. um I know that I know your writing practice is pretty steady. I'm sure it kind of ebbs and flows or whatever. And from what you said before we started recording, I think you've been pretty active with your writing. And um, so for you personally, what has, I guess, what fuels discipline when it comes to a writing practice for you?
well, I'll admit I'm a pretty disciplined person in general.
Nice.
I really like, I mean, not with everything in life, but I really like routine. So routine is probably the driving force, because when I have routine, things kind of fall into place. So it's really just a matter of habit, I think, and also just the desire to generate, really as much as possible, um, within reason. I never put writing on a higher pedestal than like living itself, which
Hmm.
I don't know, I think is kind of important to emphasize. I see writing as like a process that should kind of inform and sort of build more meaning and like maybe I don't know, just sort of being sort of a life enhancer, I guess you could say in some
Well, it
ways.
shouldn't swallow your life, but it should enrich your life.
Exactly. Right. Absolutely.
And
I'm
I
not
know
sure if I
you
answered
know
your question. Sorry.
no, you did, and I know you're a musician as well, so I'm curious. I'm always curious about like multimedia artists, and how like the different mediums, like the overlaps between what they get out of those mediums, and then kind of the things that each one offers them that the other doesn't. You know what I mean? So how is
Yeah,
it?
no,
Is your
absolutely.
relationship with music very different with your writing, or are there a lot of overlaps?
I would say that that they're it's pretty different. It's pretty different. I mean, I think like a lot of people that started playing music before they started writing, which is what happened with me. I started playing music when I was in middle school, and I really didn't start writing poetry until I was in university. Um, Maybe not even until grad school, until I was actually writing poetry that I think could stand alone by itself, But what happened for me is that for years and years and years, for the majority of my life until grad school, I was writing poetry that was kind of for music. It was lyrical. I mean, it was they were music lyrics that, because I didn't quite know what to do with poetry, let's say. So in some ways, I think I had to figure out how to keep them separate. How do you write lyrics for a song and how do you write a poem?
Yeah.
And it hasn't been, again, until rather recently that I felt comfortable bringing them back together, in the sense that, I've always felt comfortable writing lyrics for songs in which the words are sung, and for years now, I guess, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years or so, I felt pretty confident in writing standalone poems. But over the past couple of years, after I've had the great experience of being able to work with musicians, very talented musicians that play, um, I don't know, instruments that I'm not used to playing with, like a cello and a violin and bouzouki and mandolin, and the list goes on.
Oh yeah.
I feel like that I've been able to find ways to, let's say, um, read my poems out loud over their music. And this is
Mm,
something that that has been quite recent, but it's a different approach. But when you're working with the right musicians, I think that you can absolutely do it. And so that's kind of, I guess, the journey that I've been on, at least with music and poetry as something that for forever have been intertwined, but for us they've been kind of separated in some ways. And so I've been, I guess, dealing with how to develop my approach to both, and further develop my approach to writing both, and then figuring ways to make them more well, interdisciplinary or multimodal, because I think that it's super exciting to bring them together.
yeah.
Specifically because some of the best for me, and some of the best poetry that's been written has been set to music. I'm a huge rap fan, and I think that what is going on right now in hip hop is some of the most exciting work that's been done in terms of contemporary poetry. And so I'm very, very, I have my ear to the ground, let's say. That's something that I like to follow, to keep my finger on that pulse. Because I think that these two disciplines, which again we've separated, but I think that that there are lots of ways that we can connect them.
That's beautiful. I'm a huge rap fan as well, and you're right. I mean, it is poetry essentially, and there are some amazing rappers who are amazing poets. And I'm very interested in so you're actually you're experimenting with reading your poems, not singing them, but reading them over instrumentation and stuff, right?
Mhm. Yep.
I love that. Are you guys going to record anything like that, or have you recorded that?
We have not recorded anything yet, but we have a project in the works. And I actually have some poems that are coming out at Heavy Feather Review right now. They're running like a serialization. I think I told you about it actually.
Yeah.
Of these poems from this chapbook that I wrote last year called The Dust That Sings. And I'm actually sort of working with the bands to develop some music, mostly improvised, to sort of accompany these poems, so that we will have a video and an audio recording of some some music that is, let's say, thematically and aesthetically kind of appropriate for the poems themselves. So that will be probably one of the first times that we record something. Um, but for the Pollen Path book release party, the band did accompany me on that. And while we didn't record it, it was the first time in which I had read over, let's say, musicians playing, and
Yeah.
that was super exciting. It did something that I think words alone can't do, especially for an international audience, which is what we had. So we had like varying levels of English proficiency, let's say, um, and adding music to it obviously just brings people in, I think, in a way that is not as possible with words.
That's awesome. I love that. That's great. I wish you guys the best on that. And I got a couple things to ask you there in response to that. Number one, who is the rapper that you're maybe most impressed by right now, or that you listen to the most right now? And number two is, I want to make sure that anybody who watches this knows where to find your music and your poetry. So You released a book last year called The Pollen Path, and right now the one of your projects that you're working on is getting released in a serialized manner through, say the magazine again.
The Heavy Feather Review.
Okay. Well, anybody watching this should go check that out. And then your band is called
The Ship and the Swell.
And you guys, do you have any I know you have, where can people find that music online?
If you go to Spotify, you can find 2 songs from an album that's currently in the making. If it weren't for COVID, the album would be completed. But we were actually in the studio when the pandemic began. So we were able to get 2 songs recorded and mastered and up on Spotify. There are also a couple of YouTube videos that are floating around out there too that you can find.
Oh yes. And then your favorite rapper right now?
Well, it's unfortunate because he passed away last year, but MF Doom for me holds the position. I've been listening to more MF Doom than anyone else over the past year, let's say, and I'm a huge fan of his work in all of its iterations.
Yeah.
I just think it's golden.
Yeah, he's a beast. He's a beast, and his wordplay is crazy. And you know, his multi-syllabic rhymes, you know what I mean? Like he rhymes whole sentences. And that's I love that.
He exhausts vocabulary. I mean, I can't think of another way to say it. When you listen to an MF Doom song, it is like vocabulary that just unfolds. I mean, it's one unexpected turn to another unexpected turn to words, you know, at every place in a phrase, opening up and creating segues into the next line, creating segues into the next I mean, it's phenomenal. You know, it's like, I don't know what I would call it, but it's like if you like words, then it's like being in like some sort of, I don't know, like verbal chocolate factory or something. I mean, it's amazing.
Truly. Yeah, I've been a hip hop fan since I've liked music. Really, I mean, because I had a brother who was 5 years older than me, and he and his friends got into rap really early on. So I was introduced, you know, in 3rd grade or something like that, and I've been hooked ever since. But you're right, it is, you know, there's a lot of exciting things going on in hip hop right now.
I just wanted to say also that because I always like to not just leave with one recommendation for hip hop, but also No Name and Sampa the Great.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard both of them, but the 2 of them have been also, I mean, I listen to No Name almost every day and have for a year now. Fantastic.
She kills it. Oh yeah, she's an amazing lyricist. Good stuff. Well, I don't want to end completely. I want to do this last little thing if you're down.
Absolutely.
Where we pick. I want to get you to pick a number 1 through 17. What you got?
Let's do 2.
2. Okay. 2 is consciousness. So obviously that's a massive topic, and I feel like it's something I think about a lot, and I think that nobody really knows what consciousness is still, even consciousness scientists of various sorts. So yeah, I guess what are your first thoughts about consciousness? How do you feel about consciousness?
Oh man, what a great question. Well, I'm fascinated by the unconscious. That's what I'll start by saying, or Jung's model of, you know, the conscious and the unconscious. I think that we have so much to owe to what Jung calls the unconscious. And, you know, obviously there's a lot to be said about the conscious mind. But what interests me most is what comes up unexpectedly from let's say, according to Jung, the unconscious, in our dreams, in our moments of daydreaming, in our meditative states, in ecstatic states. This is the beginning of what I'll say. I'll have to stop myself though, because I might talk too long about
No, I
the
love
idea
it. We
of
don't, I mean, if
consciousness.
you have time, I have time. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Um, so you're kind of, I'm sure, you're fascinated with the conscious mind and consciousness, but you're kind of even more drawn to um, unconscious, the unconsciousness, the unconscious mind from a Jung perspective. So do you think more about kind of more of a personal unconscious or more of the collective unconscious? Which one are you drawn to more?
I think I think they're both very useful. And again, I have to stress the word model here, because I don't necessarily think that this is the only way for us to understand consciousness, but I think that it's extremely helpful. I use it a lot when I teach, like, let's say, the idea stage, the idea generation stage in creative writing, for example, um, just to help people kind of visualize um, something that we can't quite explain, right? So yeah. So yeah, I would stress the use of the word model here, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I actually forgot your original question.
Oh,
Sorry,
I'm just
Matthew.
wondering, I'm wondering because I'm very interested in Carl Jung, but when it comes to the unconscious and him, I I often automatically kind of think of the two levels of it, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So I'm curious about which one you're more interested in.
I think I'm more interested in the personal unconscious, though I also find the collective unconscious to be quite interesting as well. I mean, the idea that we have potentially been, well, this is my sort of understanding and also kind of my own thoughts or beliefs kind of tagged onto the model as well, is that, over time we've developed, you could say, a collective unconscious as a species. um, I think that, as you know, we've talked about Joseph Campbell before, the comparative mythologist, who for me is someone that I always go back to time and time again.
Gotcha.
Um, and when you think about, let's say, commonalities in what we dream about, right, and commonalities
Archetypes.
again in spiritual practices, I mean, these are things that could be explained by the collective unconscious, and I find that to be fascinating, and particularly fascinating um, because it shows us how similar we are. Not just similar, but that, sort of our ideas seem to be coming from the same place. And if that's some place that's buried inside of our minds, that we share, let's say, that has sort of evolved with us over time, then that's cool. And I think that this model for understanding the conscious and the unconscious, I think can serve as a tool,
Yeah.
to understand this.
Now, when it comes to the personal unconscious, do you think about that in terms of creativity and art often? Because I know
All the
for
time.
me, like ever since I started writing poetry in college, I thought about, I almost wanted to surrender to, I guess I could either say the unconscious or intuition. And I was wanting something spontaneous that was, you know, off of the radar, under the radar, of the conscious mind, kind of like the surrealist, But so do you think
Mhm.
about that when you're writing poetry and maybe even fiction? Are you trying to harness the unconscious in some way?
Absolutely. And I mean, again, I was stating before that some of, yeah,
I
yeah, I'm
lost
here.
you for a
I'm
second.
not
I'm
sure
not
what
sure what
happened.
happened.
Sorry about that. I hope that,
It's all good. It's still
okay,
recording,
okay.
so I think it's fine.
Okay, good, good, good. So I'll start a little bit before it cut off just to make sure you get it.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said before, I think some of the most rewarding experiences that I've had in generating ideas as a writer has been while cooking, let's say, or while, on the go. out in the world, period. And so I think that that these ideas kind of came forth when they were unexpected. And I
Mm,
think that, again, using the idea of the unconscious helps me understand where these ideas come from, then how to make sure that I can continue having them.
yeah.
And I think that the best ideas for poems, the best lines for poems, come in these states. And I also believe that ideas for fiction, good ideas for fiction come from the same state. And that once you sit down to write again, those works of fiction, that if you can fall into again or activate the unconscious, let's say, or dip into it, I'm not quite sure, let the unconscious like speak through you, or like, I don't know, shut the conscious brain up. I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but I
Yeah.
think that these are all ways of like, let's say, tapping into it.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And some of my most rewarding and exciting experiences writing poetry, because I guess one difference that I'm seeing between maybe the process that I have with your process is that I, for better or for worse, I like to let the unconscious work on the page. Like I'm like in the act of writing, I'm trying to let the unconscious kind of speak rather than um, you know, and I'm obviously, if I am cooking or if I'm driving or walking or whatever, like ideas are kind of cropping up, and I I don't often, I'll have some really cool image or phrase or idea that pops up spontaneously in any given moment of the day, but just like a dream that when I wake up in the morning, unless I write it down, I often don't remember it, and then I'm really beating myself up. I'm like, no, So I quickly, I guess, if I do have a spontaneous idea that comes from the unconscious, we'll say, um, I quickly grab the journal, because otherwise I'm going to probably forget it. But um, so yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to say about that?
I'm right there with you. I mean, I think that the most important thing to do as a writer is to have something to write down your ideas as they come unexpectedly.
Yeah,
People have this romanticized idea of a writer at a desk, and I think that that is only a portion of the work. I mean, the real work is at getting the ideas when they come, and not
yeah.
actively pursuing them. I think it's passively being open to them. Like, I don't know if you've listened to Jack Spicer's Vancouver lectures, available on Pen Sounds, or
I
if you're
have
familiar with,
not, but I've read a lot of his work and I love his poetry.
I mean, his idea of the radio antenna, um, and the poet being like, on, the poet's radio antenna, sort of the receiver being on in order to receive the messages. That when that metaphor was introduced to me by David Bottoms, at Georgia State, that was it for me, because I that allowed me to understand the process in a way that I had not before. Because going back to what we were talking about in terms of, the rational mind, the conscious mind, the, let's say, the Western, problem solution based mind. um, I was going at things very actively, and saying, I want to write a poem about X, and then sit down and write a poem about X until it was finished. And I wanted there to be this, A, B, and C in it and everything. And that isn't necessarily the best way to go about writing poems, or at least coming up with ideas for poems.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't listened to his lectures, but I think I must have read some of the transcriptions of those, because I know what you're talking about with. So I think with art, and especially poetry and music, and I mean, yeah, I guess kind of every genre of art. I think that there are practitioners of that genre that, you know, really open themselves up to the unconscious or the intuition, or where they're trying to kind of remove the control of the conscious mind and let something else speak through. And those are usually the ones I really resonate with the most. And I know when I read back a poem and it feels like I'm surprised that I wrote it. You know what I mean? Like when I feel like I'm surprised that that language came out, those are the poems I like the most. If I remember every calculated thought about why I should write some line, it's like, I mean, and I think it depends on the individual. You know, I took a fiction class one time at SF State when I was going there to get my MFA. It was the only fiction class I took. Everything else was poetry. But I really enjoyed taking that class, and it taught me a lot about story writing. But you know, the professor would say that some writers are more like, I'm trying to remember the word he used, but basically like would free write more and not plan out as much, and then of course go back and edit after free writing and stuff like that. But and then some writers, you know, kind of work better under the mode of mapping it out and of kind of pre conceiving the whole thing. And so I don't ever want to necessarily say that one is better than the other, but I know for me, the stuff that I'm more excited about is the stuff that's not as pre-planned, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So last note on the consciousness thing, I want to just run this idea by you and see what you think. Because I've been thinking, you know, consciousness is it's a big topic in science these days, and a big topic always has been a big topic in spirituality. And I've been digging into a lot of Hinduism and Vedanta and everything. And so, you know, there is this notion in a lot of mystical traditions that consciousness is, and I hate to use the word pure consciousness because I know that that's, you know, language is so tricky, but I'll just use it for as a concession because words only go so far. But if we think of something as pure consciousness, consciousness that doesn't have an object, consciousness that is not conscious of something, you know, and so they will ask this question like, what does consciousness have to do to be conscious of itself? And then to me, I'm like, well, it doesn't have to do anything to be conscious of itself. And so this notion of pure consciousness that is like unstained, right? That is like, I guess in a lot of meditation traditions, it would be kind of like the watcher, where, but of course they talk about a level beyond the watcher too, but like the watcher where, or the observer, where we can get into a state of mind where we are watching or observing the sensations that arise in our consciousness. We're watching and observing our thoughts and our feelings. And if we can do that, then it feels a lot like the consciousness itself is actually not affected by those sensations. It's just aware of them. And so that's one thing. I want to hear what you have to say about that. But well, actually, before I move on, let's hear your thoughts on that.
Now that is a difficult question, mostly because I feel unqualified to answer it, to be honest.
Yeah, what's your personal feeling though? I know it's hard to imagine something. It's hard to imagine for me something that is unconditioned, because I feel like everything in some way is conditioned by something. But there is this through line in a lot of mystical traditions of this kind of, whether you want to call it pure consciousness or pure being. And I feel like there is something that feels right about that, especially when I meditate.
I don't know where to start. You've stumped. I'm stumped.
That's okay.
I can say that. I mean, because I think that this can probably be explained in a scientific way, you know, in terms of sensory experience and having the ability to not only sort of have sensory experiences, but also reflect on sensory experiences. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos made by this organization in Northern Europe. I forget which country it's in, called Kurzgesagt. Have you heard of this? No,
I don't think so.
It translates to in a nutshell
Okay.
from, I don't remember what language it is, and but it's a fascinating organization that puts out these videos that are animated, and they sort of explore questions of this nature, and most of it is based in science, and that they have they play out these scenarios of, let's say, how consciousness developed. This is the first thing that comes to mind, because to me, at the end of the day, from a human perspective, in which everything that we experience, going back to what we were talking about in the very beginning of the conversation, if in my opinion, based on what I've read, if I understand correctly, right? you you know what we experience is based on what we can perceive through our senses. Well, that's quite limited. But if what we understand is based on sensory experiences, then we are also somehow able to reflect on those experiences, to think about them as they're happening, and also reflect and remember them. I have no idea if that comes close to answering your question, to be honest, but that would be the first step, I think, or one way of responding to that question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I know it's a heavy thing. It's a heavy topic. And what I said was, you know, different from how we kind of usually think about consciousness, but it's something that I've thought about. And, and when it comes to this sort of thing, that we're going back to what you said about models, it's like there's all different models, and I think it's important for me. I like to be playful with the models. I like to I never want to claim that whatever I'm saying about a topic like this is anything other than a model. It's just a model, and I like experimenting with different models, and what consequences different models have, and how can I test a certain model in my direct experience, and that sort of thing. I guess one way I've been thinking about this is that in spiritual language, I guess to me, the spirit would be consciousness, and the way I've been feeling about that lately is that is that which is unbounded, unconditioned, and somehow unaffected and unstained. And then soul, even though I know that word has all these words have a lot of baggage, but the way I've been thinking about soul, not in the sense of a personal soul, but soul in a larger way, it's almost like the masculine and the feminine of God or something, where spirit and consciousness relates to Shiva in Tantra traditions, which is pure consciousness or pure being, and then Shakti is pure energy and the fuel that kind of keeps on making the phenomenal world keep unfolding, but the way I've been thinking about soul lately, kind of as the archetypally feminine or something like that, is the part of reality or part of the divine or something that is that which is conditioned and that which remembers in a collective consciousness type of way. This crazy, ever-growing kind of invisible thing, whether we're talking about the collective unconscious, whether we're talking about behaviors that are learned in different species that are passed on, where a baby of a certain type of animal might automatically be pretty developed right away and knows exactly what's going on and has all these instincts, and so that's the way I've been thinking of the soul. like on a big level, is the part of reality that the big cloud that remember the field, kind of a field that remembers and carries on, and that is infused in everything, but that continues to evolve, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. I mean, it's that model. I love using the term model, also framework.
Yeah, no, it's fun, right?
Um, but but yeah, I love that. It's a lot to unpack. I took some notes actually because I'm interested in like mulling this over a bit more.
Yeah.
But because it's a bit complex, but I
Yeah,
do
sorry.
understand what. No. But I do understand what you mean, though. But you're sort of separating the spirit from the soul, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Well, I think that, of course, at the end of the day, there are always these seeming, opposites or something, but just like the yin and the yang, or pretty much a million different archetypal symbols that represent things that appear like they're two, but they're actually one. So I wouldn't
Right.
say that they're disconnected or just, separate or anything like that. I just think it's the two main expressions of the divine or something.
Cool.
Yeah. But it just reminded me, when you were talking about the unconscious, and how I think sometimes when I'm writing and I'm tapping into the unconscious or tapping into intuition, or even when I have dreams, and Jung would talk about people having dreams and himself having dreams, about where images would pop up that didn't have anything to do explicitly with his personal life. It was like an image that was coming from the big the soul, or whatever, as I was talking about it. And so I wonder, when we're writing poetry and stuff, like where those when the ideas and the images and the lines come through, who knows where they're coming from?
Yeah, definitely.
At the end of the
I
day.
think absolutely. I totally agree with you. There are these books that I've been reading recently. Well, one I read a year and a half ago, but they're by the same author. His name's David Lewis Williams.
Oh,
And the first book that I read was published in the early 2000s, called The Mind in the Cave.
okay.
And then the book that I'm reading right now is called Inside the Neolithic Mind. And it's two very interesting books that talk about consciousness, basically. And the first book is, well, both books explore sort of like the question, why, how have Homo sapiens been creating the type of art that they have been creating for tens of thousands of years. So it
Yeah.
goes back to the Upper Paleolithic period and looks at cave paintings, and basically says that the reason why art was created was for spiritual sort of reasons. And beyond that, not just for spiritual reasons, but they were sort of influenced by altered states of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
from chanting, or from praying, from a wide range of
Yeah.
practices.
Psychedelic substances,
Um,
possibly.
yes. So really fascinating. Two books, like highly recommend, because
So
I think
Mind
they
in the
they get at
Cave,
this.
and what was the
Mhm.
other one?
Inside the Neolithic Mind.
Nice. That sounds
So,
cool.
so the first one, again, goes back Upper Paleolithic, and then with the Neolithic, so it goes from cave paintings to, in the second book, large, mostly stone structures that are in the Near East and in Atlantic Europe. And it looks at sort of, and of course during the Neolithic period, so it's once agriculture has started.
Yeah.
And it just explores the artifacts that have been discovered. So, like, the two big finds, of course, the one in the cave, where the paintings found in Spain and France from like 40,000 years ago, more or less. And then the second book explores things that were found like in the Near East, for example, like skulls that were found in the floorboard, like under the floors like these arrangements of skulls facing each other with like shells, like masks over the skulls with shells embedded in their eyes. Very cool, very cool.
Interesting.
And mostly interesting because it explores, well, it argues that, like, since we are Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens have been around for as long as we've been around, our consciousness has been the same. Is what the
Interesting.
books argue, what this author argues. So it kind of gets at what you're like, the questions
Yeah.
that we're
Yeah.
asking and trying to answer.
Those sound like amazing books. That's right up my alley. I appreciate you dropping those seeds for me. I wrote it down. And I will say that, taking the history of Western art when I was in my second year of college, or maybe even my second semester, totally altered my whole life. And that's it, like, and we started with caves, and there was something about that, and something about looking at the ancient cave paintings or objects that humans created, and what that said about, or what those things that they painted or created, kind of, what did all that suggest about the human condition and human culture and stuff. So since I took that class, I have had like a massive thirst for learning more about that sort of thing. So thanks, man. This is fun. This was really great, and I hope you had fun as well.
Absolutely, it's been great. It's been fantastic. Great way to start the day.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, I think that's it on my end. And I would love to, talk to you more. So reach out to me whenever you want. And
Cool.
nice.
Thanks so much,
Well,
Matthew.
thanks
This
so
has been
much,
awesome, man. And I would also like to catch up some more too. It'd be great.
I'm glad that, I know that we only had met a couple times in Atlanta and all that stuff, and then hung out in LA and everything. But I'm glad that we crossed paths and that we stayed in touch.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Same here. And like, I'm sure eventually we'll see each other on the West Coast or probably not in the Southeast, but maybe,
yeah,
or
it's
in Europe.
Yep.
Yeah.
Truth.
Cool, man.
Well, take care of yourself. All right.
All right. You too. Take it easy and let me know if you need anything else. All right.
All right. Peace, man.
All right, dude. See ya. Ciao.